Standing on my own front porch with my 2 young grandchildren clutching my hands, I watched my husband of 40 years slide divorce papers toward me. Right beside him, a woman young enough to be our daughter folded her arms, smiling like she had already claimed victory. She looked me dead in the eye and told me to pack my bags because the house had no room for a parasite. What neither of them realized was that just 1 hour earlier, I had inherited $24 million and a Manhattan skyscraper, with the legal envelope sitting quietly inside my purse. Instead of crying or cowering, I simply smiled, which immediately infuriated her. She snapped at me, demanding to know what was so funny. I took a slow breath, looked her straight in the eye, and prepared to tell her that this house actually belonged to me. But before you can understand how a quiet 62-year-old grandmother ended up holding the biggest secret of her life on that front porch, you need to know how I got there. My name is Margaret Vance, though everyone in our quiet suburban town in Westchester, New York, always called me Marge. Up until that week, I lived a completely ordinary, low-profile life. I worked 3 afternoons a week at the local public library, helping children find books and chatting with retirees. It was quiet work, but it gave my days purpose, especially after 40 years of marriage to my husband, Arthur. When Arthur and I first started out, we had absolutely nothing. Our first apartment had peeling wallpaper, a noisy refrigerator, and 2 folding lawn chairs for a dining room set. Arthur dreamed of building a commercial construction company, and I believed in him so much that I worked double shifts at a medical office to keep us afloat. I managed his books after putting our kids to bed and skipped buying new winter coats so his company could buy its first flatbed truck. Eventually, his company became a massive success, and local business leaders praised him for being a self-made man. I never bothered to correct them because I believed marriage was a partnership, not a scoreboard. Our daughter, Clara, was now 38, raising 2 kids on her own while working as a physical therapist. Our son, Julian, was 35 and taught high school history, always telling his students that life was defined by the choices people made when nobody was watching. The morning my life flipped completely upside down began like any other. I was shelving fiction titles at the library when my phone vibrated with an unfamiliar Manhattan area code. I normally ignore unknown numbers, but something urged me to pick up. A distinguished, polite voice identified himself as legal counsel representing the estate of my late great-aunt, Victoria Whitmore. Aunt Victoria was a legendary figure in our family who had gradually isolated herself after my grandmother passed away decades ago. She had never married, wore high-end tailor-made suits, and spent her life quietly buying commercial real estate throughout New York City. The attorney calmly informed me that she had passed away 3 weeks prior and that I had been named the sole beneficiary of her entire fortune, including $24 million in liquid funds and a prime midtown skyscraper. The news was so staggering that I had to lean against a bookshelf to keep my balance. The attorney asked for absolute confidentiality until the official transfer documents were signed in his office the following morning. I gave him my word, hung up the phone, and stood frozen in the quiet library aisle. My immediate thoughts were not about luxury cars or diamonds, but about paying off Clara's mortgage and funding Julian's school projects before quietly planning a peaceful retirement trip with Arthur. I finished my work shift in a complete daze, picked up my grandchildren, Leo and Maya, from school, and drove toward home. But as I pulled into our driveway, the peaceful afternoon vanished. 2 sleek, expensive luxury SUVs were parked in front of the garage. My flower pots had been roughly shoved aside on the porch to make room for 6 stacked cardboard boxes, one of which had my name written across it in thick black marker. Arthur was standing on the porch alongside a stylish, 30-something woman named Chloe Bennett, a high-end commercial real estate agent whose name I had seen pop up on Arthur's phone for months. Whenever I had asked about her, Arthur brushed it off as business. Now, seeing them together beside my packed belongings, the ugly reality hit me instantly. Chloe handed me a manila folder filled with legal filings, informing me that Arthur had filed for divorce months ago behind my back. Arthur stood there silently, letting her do all the talking. She proudly announced that Arthur had outgrown our marriage and that it was time for me to step aside. I looked at the man I had built a life with for 4 decades, expecting a shred of remorse, but all I saw in his eyes was cold detachment. I gently asked my neighbor to watch Leo and Maya next door so they would not have to witness the cruelty unfolding on the porch. Once the children were safely out of earshot, Chloe stepped closer and told me I had been living off Arthur's hard work for long enough. She pointed at the front door and snapped that I needed to pick up my boxes and clear out because the house had no room for a parasite. That was the exact moment when all my anxiety dissolved into absolute clarity. I reached into my purse, feeling the thick, sealed envelope from the estate attorney, and realized how powerless their petty cruelty really was. I looked Chloe in the face, let out a calm smile, and told her that this house actually belonged entirely to me. Arthur let out a condescending laugh, claiming I was out of my mind, but his face turned pale when I reminded him of the financial crisis 15 years ago. Back then, when his construction business was facing total bankruptcy and aggressive creditors, his own legal counsel advised him to transfer the full title of our residential property into my name to protect our home. He had intended to transfer it back once the company recovered, but in the chaos of business, he completely forgot to do so. The smug confidence immediately drained from Chloe's face as she turned to Arthur, demanding to know if what I was saying was true. Arthur stood frozen, unable to utter a single word, realization washing over him that he had just tried to evict me from a house he did not legally own. I calmly pulled my key out, unlocked the front door, and told them my legal team would review their divorce papers before shutting the door firmly behind me. That night, I stayed in the quiet house with my grandchildren, serving them simple dinners and holding them tight, knowing that my priority was protecting my family's emotional peace. Arthur never returned to the property that evening. The following morning, after dropping the kids off at summer camp, I boarded the train into Manhattan to claim my new life. Sitting in the high-floor conference room of the law firm near Bryant Park, I signed the final transfer documents alongside the managing partner. I was handed a private, handwritten letter left behind by Aunt Victoria. In it, she wrote that she had closely observed our family over the decades and chose me because I was the only person who possessed the resilience, integrity, and quiet strength required to manage her legacy responsibility. Equipped with my newfound wealth and absolute financial freedom, I hired the top legal defense team in the state to process the divorce. Because the house was legally mine and the funds were derived from a separate inheritance, Arthur was left with no claim to my fortune, while his own misconduct damaged his public reputation in our town. I used the inheritance to establish a substantial trust fund for Clara and Julian, ensuring my children and grandchildren would never worry about financial security again. Standing at the high window of my midtown office building, looking out over the expansive skyline, I realized that true strength does not come from holding on to the past. It comes from having the courage to close a painful chapter, knowing that you have the power to write an extraordinary new beginning.